The Civil Rights Movement was a period of time in American history where people protested against discriminatory laws, policies and practices. It is often considered to be the most successful social movement in U.S. history, a battle that won major concessions from those who were once indifferent or even hostile toward it. The movement mobilized all sorts of people, including women and African Americans who hadn't previously been active participants, sometimes called new activists. The 1954 Supreme Court decision in Brown v. Board of Education was a big victory for civil rights activists. The court ruled that segregation in public schools was unconstitutional, and ordered schools to desegregate their facilities by the end of 1954. Mississippi, Alabama and Georgia were two states who resisted this order. However, it wasn't long before these three states were experiencing huge economic losses as a result of their defiance against desegregation efforts during this time period, when black people were denied access to public transportation. SDS was a radical organization that was formed in 1960. It was founded by students and it spread throughout college campuses across the country. In some cases, SDS would go on to become violent and use violence to express their beliefs. In response to this violence, President John F. Kennedy created the President's Commission on Campus Unrest as part of his National Defense Education Act, NDEA. The purpose of this commission is to find ways for colleges and universities to deal with potential civil unrest or student protests without resorting to force or fear-mongering tactics like those used by police forces across America during this time period. The Mississippi Freedom Summer was a voter registration drive during the Civil Rights Movement. It was organized by the Council of Federated Organizations, COFO, which consisted of black civil rights organizations from across the South. Young volunteers, mostly white college students and white church groups, were recruited to help register African Americans in Mississippi. The volunteers spent their summers working alongside black Mississippians to register them to vote and help them get acquainted with their rights under state law as citizens. They also worked with local leaders to improve conditions in schools, churches and businesses that had been segregated since before they arrived on campus or church property: laundries, barbershops, buses, restrooms, grocery stores, etc. The Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, founded by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale in 1966, was a militant black nationalist movement that emerged from the civil rights movement. The Panthers were famous for their armed confrontations with police and their use of Afrocentric ideology to promote self-defense among African Americans. SNCC was formed in 1960, but it wasn't until 1966 that SNCC became the Student National Coordinating Committee. Ella Baker, who would later become a mentor to Martin Luther King Jr., was the founder of this organization. She wanted to create an organization that could help coordinate protests across the country and train organizers for future campaigns. In its early years, SNCC focused on voter registration drives, sit-ins at restaurants or lunch counters where blacks were not allowed entry, like Woolworths, and other non-violent forms of protest against segregation laws in public facilities such as buses and restrooms at schools or universities. The group also worked with Freedom Summer, 1964, where thousands of college students volunteered during their summer break. Many white volunteers came from all over America, but most were white men who had been pressured by family members into joining this project, despite having no prior experience working with African Americans. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, also known as the Civil Rights Act, outlawed discrimination in employment, public accommodations and education. It also included new protections for voting rights. The Black Power movement was a protest movement in the United States that began in 1966, primarily among African Americans. It sought to empower African Americans and address racial issues through black nationalism. It was a response to the civil rights movement that began after World War II, when many blacks demanded equal treatment under the law. The Black Power movement was also an attempt by many African Americans to establish a strong sense of nationality within their communities as well as abroad, especially in Africa. This idea was called Pan-Africanism, which combined elements from several different cultures into something new and different, a culture that celebrated both European ancestry as well as African heritage. The death of Martin Luther King Jr. was a tragedy for the civil rights movement, but it also marked the beginning of a new chapter in African American history. King had been working towards equality for years by pushing for voting rights and equal treatment in schools, jobs and public spaces. On April 4, 1968, he was assassinated while standing on the balcony of his hotel room at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee, where he had been staying with friends. He was shot by James Earl Ray, who confessed to shooting him but later recanted his confession, saying he acted alone when asked by FBI agents during questioning about his role in killing Martin Luther King Jr. The civil rights movement lasted from 1954 until 1968, but Malcolm X, who was assassinated in 1965, also played a major role. Malcolm X was born Malcolm Little on May 19, 1925 and grew up in Roxbury, Massachusetts. He became involved with the Nation of Islam, NOI, when he was a teenager and joined its leadership after graduation from high school. In 1953 he changed his name to El Hajj Malik Shabazz after converting to Islam and taking an Islamic name himself, later changing it again before settling on Malcolm as his legal name for most purposes. In 1954 he began speaking about creating an independent state for African Americans called Black Mecca, which would be located somewhere in Africa where they could practice their religion freely without having to interact with whites much at all. This would mean that there wouldn't be any integration between races because everything would be separated by color lines, and that includes bathrooms too. The civil rights movement was a time of incredible change in America. The movement began in 1954, when the Supreme Court ruled that segregation was unconstitutional. This decision resulted in the desegregation of schools and public facilities across the country. However, it wasn't until 1960 that students started to organize themselves into groups like SNCC and SDS, Students for a Democratic Society, which led protests against racial discrimination at universities around the country. Later on, these organizations became part of a larger movement called Black Power.